They thought they could humiliate her, frame her, and erase her dignity without consequence. What they didn't know was that Elena Brooks had a storm waiting for them, a storm powerful enough to tear down everything they thought they controlled. Stay with us, because you're about to witness the moment justice didn't just knock, it kicked the door down. Before we dive into the heart of the story, tell us, where are you watching from and what time is it right now in your country? We love seeing our community from around the world. And don't forget, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join us for more powerful real-life stories that inspire change. Elena Brooks had no idea that the simplest of errands would change her life forever. It was supposed to be an ordinary night, the kind of night you barely remember the next day. A pharmacy visit, a short drive, then home to collapse into bed after an exhausting double shift at the hospital. At 57, Elena knew exhaustion intimately. 30 years of nursing had carved resilience into her bones, but even the strongest souls feel the weight of too many thankless days. The Georgia air was heavy that evening, thick with the lingering heat of a brutal summer. As she pulled into the half-lit strip mall parking lot, only a few stores remained open, their neon signs buzzing faintly. The pharmacy sat at the corner, bathed in a sickly yellow glow that made it look more foreboding than welcoming. Elena parked under the only flickering streetlight, grabbed her purse and her prescription slip, and walked toward the door with the tired grace of a woman who refused to let exhaustion slow her dignity. Inside, the pharmacy was nearly deserted. A teenage clerk slouched behind the counter, aimlessly scrolling through his phone. Elena offered him a polite, weary smile as she handed over her ID, insurance card, and the doctor's note for her blood pressure medication. It was a routine she had performed 100 times. She expected no surprises. But minutes stretched longer than they should have. The clerk frowned at the screen, then whispered something to the manager hovering nearby, a woman with sharp features and a tighter-than-comfort expression named Brenda Lawson. Brenda leaned over, examining Elena's paperwork with thinly veiled suspicion. Her mouth tightened, and the atmosphere shifted, subtly but unmistakably. Elena immediately sensed the change, that silent, heavy weight that creeps in when you are no longer seen as a customer, but a problem. Every black person knows that feeling, when judgment walks in long before words are even spoken. Brenda's fake smile was brittle as she said, "I'm sorry, ma'am, but there seems to be an issue with your prescription." Elena kept her voice steady. "That must be a mistake. I've picked up my meds here for years." Brenda hesitated, then stepped back slightly. "Your account information doesn't match. We can't process it tonight." Elena leaned in a little, her voice calm but firm. "You have my ID, you have my insurance card. Everything checks out." Brenda, however, had already stepped away, tapping something into the register and murmuring to the clerk, who looked more and more uncomfortable. Then Brenda returned, her voice saccharine but her eyes cold. "Please wait here, ma'am. We've contacted the authorities." For a split second, Elena thought she had misheard. "Authorities?" she repeated, her voice dangerously level. The clerk kept his eyes fixed on the floor. Elena's heart raced, not from guilt, she had nothing to hide, but from the heavy dread that came when you realized you were already judged without evidence. She could have left. She could have grabbed her documents and walked out, but walking away would look like guilt. And Elena Brooks had fought too many battles in her life to back down now. She stood her ground. Minutes dragged by. Then came the sirens, a harsh sound slicing through the thick Georgia night air. The pharmacy door chimed, and 2 white police officers entered, radiating the easy arrogance of men used to not being questioned. Officer Derek Monroe led the way, a stocky man with a permanent sneer. Behind him was Officer Kyle Bennett, thinner, younger, and visibly less sure of himself. Brenda rushed toward them, eager. "That's her," she hissed, pointing at Elena without hesitation. "Tried to pick up meds with false information, probably identity theft." Monroe didn't check the paperwork. He didn't ask any questions. He looked at Elena the way a wolf looks at a cornered rabbit. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step outside," he said, voice dripping with contempt. Elena stood tall. "I have done nothing wrong." Monroe's hand hovered lazily over the cuffs on his belt. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way." His voice made it clear he was itching for the hard way. The few customers who were left in the store backed away nervously. One man started recording quietly with his phone. Good, Elena thought. Let them record everything. She calmly raised her ID and insurance card again. All the information you need is right here. Monroe didn't even glance. He stepped forward, grabbed Elena's wrist roughly, and yanked it behind her back. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into her skin with brutal finality. Gasps rippled through the store. Brenda stood smugly behind the counter, her arms folded, victorious before the game was even played. Elena didn't resist. She had seen too many people whose resistance became their death sentence. She allowed herself to be marched through the aisles like a criminal, even as humiliation and rage burned inside her. The flickering streetlight outside cast a sickly glow on the squad car as Monroe shoved her into the back seat. Through the window, Elena locked eyes with Brenda Lawson one last time. She didn't look away. In that moment, even with her hands cuffed and her dignity stripped raw, Elena Brooks made a silent vow. You think this ends here. You have no idea what you've just unleashed. The squad car rolled through the dark Georgia streets, its sirens now silent but its lights casting erratic flashes over the sidewalks. Elena sat stiffly in the back seat, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into her wrists. She stared out the window, jaw tight, forcing herself to stay calm. She knew better than to plead, to explain, to expect any fairness tonight. Officer Monroe and Officer Bennett sat in the front, talking in low voices like she wasn't even there, just a package to be processed and discarded. As they pulled into the station's cracked parking lot, Elena's mind sharpened. She hadn't resisted, she hadn't raised her voice. Everything that was about to happen would be carved into official records, and she needed to remember every detail. The building loomed ahead, ugly and squat, its fluorescent lights buzzing against the humid night air. Monroe yanked the door open with a jerk. "Let's go," he barked. Elena climbed out slowly, head high, her dignity intact even if her wrists throbbed from the tightness of the cuffs. Inside, the precinct was no better. Dirty linoleum floors, walls painted a depressing off-white, the faint smell of stale coffee and disinfectant lingering in the air. Other officers loitered, their conversations halting as they noticed her. Some watched with idle curiosity, others with thinly veiled disdain. No one offered a glance of sympathy. To them, she was already categorized: suspect, problem, nuisance. Monroe shoved a clipboard at the booking sergeant and loudly declared, "Prescription fraud, caught red-hand." The sergeant, a balding man with sagging jowls, barely glanced at Elena before nodding lazily. "Print her and put her in holding." Elena said nothing as they fingerprinted her roughly, rolling each sore finger over the black ink pad, pressing too hard, not caring. They snapped her mugshot without warning, the flash burning her eyes. The entire process was mechanical, indifferent, designed to strip a person of identity and reduce them to case number. As they marched her toward the holding cells, Elena caught snatches of muttered conversations. Another fraud case. Figures. They never learn. Each casual insult landed like a slap. Not because she believed any of it, but because she knew how easily these whispers could shape perceptions, cement lies. The cell door clanged shut behind her, sealing her in a grim, cold box. A bare metal bench, a flickering light overhead, the smell of bleach thick in the stale air. Officer Monroe leaned against the bars, smirking. "You want to tell us the real story now?" he mocked. Elena met his gaze, unwavering. "The real story," she said quietly, "is that you're making the biggest mistake of your life." Monroe laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. He didn't know it yet, but the ground beneath him was already starting to crack. Left alone, Elena sat rigid on the bench. She focused on her breathing, slow and measured, fighting off the swirl of anger, fear, and humiliation. Every fiber of her being screamed to fight back, to shout, to demand justice. But she knew better. She would fight smart, not reckless. Somewhere deep inside her, a cold, steady fire burned brighter with every passing minute. Outside the holding cells, the station buzzed with the usual lazy rhythm of late-night police work. Phones rang, papers shuffled, boots thudded against the floor. But an undercurrent of unease was starting to spread. It began as a murmur at the front desk. A phone call answered with stiff shoulders and hurried "Yes, sir" replies. A sergeant stiffening as he scribbled a note, glancing nervously toward the back hallway. In her cell, Elena couldn't hear the exact words, but she felt the shift, like the barometric pressure dropping before a storm. Footsteps approached, measured, deliberate. Not the careless swagger of Monroe, but something colder, heavier. Officer Bennett appeared at the end of the hall first, his face pale, his movements twitchy. He glanced toward Elena's cell, then quickly looked away. Behind him came two men in dark suits, their badges flashing under the flickering lights. Federal agents. Real ones. And walking between them, with a calm, lethal presence that seemed to make the very walls stand straighter, was Leonard Brooks. He hadn't rushed, he hadn't ranted, he had moved like a force of nature, inevitable and undeniable. Leonard's eyes swept the hallway and landed on Elena. His face didn't soften. Not here, not now. But there was a flicker of acknowledgement, a silent message: "You're not alone. Hold on." Then he turned to Officer Monroe, who was swaggering toward them, unaware of the noose tightening around his own neck. "Who's in charge here?" Leonard's voice was quiet, but carried the weight of command. The desk sergeant stammered, stepping forward. "I am, sir." Leonard didn't even glance at him. "Good. Then you'll explain why a nurse with valid ID and a clean record is sitting in a holding cell tonight. And you'll do it very carefully. Because as of 20 minutes ago, this isn't just your problem. It's the Department of Justice's problem." Silence fell like a hammer. Officers who had been leaning casually against walls straightened. Bennett practically melted into the background, trying to disappear. Monroe's face turned a shade of red that suggested anger and fear. Elena sat perfectly still, every sense heightened. She knew this was the moment when everything would start to change. Slowly, unstoppably. Leonard nodded to one of the agents, who stepped forward, keyring in hand. Monroe barked, "You can't just—" But Leonard silenced him with a look that brooked no argument. The cell door creaked open. Elena rose slowly, refusing to rush, refusing to act like a criminal grateful for freedom. She stepped past Monroe without sparing him a glance. She walked straight to Leonard's side, head high. For the first time that night, Elena allowed herself to breathe deeply. This wasn't over, not even close. But the tide had turned. The ones who thought they could erase her dignity without consequence were about to discover just how wrong they had been. And the reckoning was only beginning. From inside the holding cell, Elena felt the shift long before she heard the sounds. There was a weight in the air, a tension that didn't belong to the usual late-night drudgery of the precinct. It was the feeling of power moving, of something big approaching, slow and inevitable, like a rising tide. She sat perfectly still on the cold metal bench, every muscle alert, breathing slow and even, refusing to show even a hint of weakness. Down the hallway, hurried footsteps echoed. Voices that had been casual now grew clipped, urgent. Phones rang and were answered with tight, formal tones. Elena couldn't make out every word, but she caught fragments. "Washington. DOJ. Special order." Her heart beat a steady drum in her chest, but her expression remained unreadable. This wasn't panic rising inside the station. It was fear. The holding cell door clanged open without warning. Officer Kyle Bennett appeared first, his face pale and drawn. He barely made eye contact with her before stepping aside, making room for the man who followed. Leonard Brooks walked in like he owned the place. He wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. Authority radiated from him the way heat radiates from a furnace. He wore a dark suit, crisp and immaculate, and his sharp gaze scanned the room like a general surveying a battlefield. Behind him were two federal agents, their badges already visible, their postures cold and formal. Leonard didn't even glance at the other officers milling around, now frozen in awkward, uncertain stances. He walked straight to the desk sergeant, whose face had gone a shade paler than the walls. Leonard spoke quietly, his voice even, but carrying to every corner of the station. "My name is Leonard Brooks. I'm here on behalf of the Department of Justice." He slid a document across the counter, a simple sheet that carried the weight of an entire federal mandate. "Effective immediately, this precinct is under formal review for civil rights violations. You will cooperate fully." The sergeant's hand shook slightly as he picked up the paper. Around the room, the ripple effect was visible. Officers straightening, conversations dying mid-sentence, nervous glances traded like secret signals. Monroe, standing off to the side, clenched his jaw hard enough to crack teeth, but he said nothing. Leonard turned toward the holding cells, his gaze settling on Elena. Their eyes met. For the first time since the nightmare began, Elena felt the smallest crack in the suffocating tension in her chest. She wasn't alone. And whatever storm Monroe and Brenda had unleashed, it was about to consume them instead. Leonard spoke again, addressing the room without raising his voice. "We have credible reports of unlawful detention, failure to verify evidence, and abuse of authority committed here tonight. As of now, all related evidence, including body cam footage, surveillance recordings, and internal communications, will be seized for federal review." The desk sergeant opened his mouth to object, but one of the federal agents took a single step forward, cutting him off with a cold stare. The sergeant swallowed his protest and nodded stiffly. Monroe stepped forward, chest puffed out in defiance. "You can't just barge in here like this," he barked. Leonard's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're mistaken, Officer Monroe. We're not barging in. We're cleaning up." He gestured toward Elena. "And we're starting with correcting one very large mistake." One agent moved to the holding cell, keys in hand. Elena stood up slowly, every movement deliberate, controlled. The door swung open with a metallic screech. She stepped out, facing Monroe directly. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She just looked him in the eye with the calm assurance of someone who knows the tide has turned. Monroe shifted uncomfortably, the false bravado draining from his posture. Leonard didn't rush. He simply said, "Return her personal effects immediately." Another agent collected Elena's belongings, a purse, her ID, her insurance card, all untouched, all still perfectly valid. It was all the proof anyone needed that this had been nothing more than humiliation dressed up as law enforcement. Leonard motioned toward the exit. "Let's go." Elena fell into step beside him. Around them, the station was unnaturally silent. Officers stared at their shoes, at the walls, at the floor, anywhere but at the woman they had paraded through their halls like a criminal. Elena walked steadily, head high, each step reclaiming a piece of the dignity they had tried to rip away. As they reached the station doors, Leonard paused and turned back to the room. His voice was still calm, but now it carried the sharpness of a blade. "You should know," he said evenly, "this isn't the end. This is the beginning. The Department of Justice doesn't knock once. It keeps knocking. Harder, louder, until the doors come off the hinges." No one answered. No one dared. Leonard opened the door for Elena, and together they stepped into the humid Georgia night. Outside, cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions. A small crowd had gathered, some with cell phones raised, others simply watching, sensing that something important was happening. Elena blinked against the sudden brightness but didn't shy away. She was no longer just a tired nurse picking up her medicine. She was the woman who had forced the system to look at itself and found it wanting. And this, she knew, was only the beginning. Inside the station, the atmosphere cracked under the invisible pressure Leonard Brooks had brought with him. Federal agents moved efficiently, their faces expressionless as they spread out. One began logging into computer terminals, another demanded access to body cam footage and surveillance tapes. A third agent pulled open file drawers, seizing records with swift, professional hands. No one in the precinct dared to interfere. The officers who had once snickered or gossiped about Elena's arrest now clung to the walls like shadows, avoiding eye contact, shrinking under the cold realization that the rules of their world had changed. Officer Monroe hovered near the front desk, his face a thundercloud of rage and fear, his fists clenched and unclenched at his sides, but he knew. Everyone knew that there was nothing he could do now without making things far worse for himself. An agent approached the booking sergeant and handed him a flash drive. "Upload all body cam footage from tonight. No deletions, no edits." The sergeant hesitated a fraction of a second too long. Leonard's voice sliced through the air, sharp and final. "Right now." The sergeant jumped to obey, his fingers fumbling over the keyboard. A hush spread through the station, thick and suffocating. The sound of files transferring filled the air, a soft, mechanical hum that somehow seemed louder than shouting. Elena stood beside Leonard, watching silently as the walls that had once held her prisoner now turned against those who had sought to break her. She wasn't smiling, she wasn't celebrating. Her face was carved from stone, calm, focused, unbreakable. Across the lobby, Officer Bennett squirmed nervously. He wasn't like Monroe. He hadn't fully embraced the corruption, but he hadn't stopped it either. Guilt weighed on him now, visible in the way he hunched his shoulders, the way his eyes darted between the federal agents and the floor. Elena saw him and recognized the look. A man realizing he had bet on the wrong side of history. Another agent called out, "We need access to personnel files for Officers Monroe and Bennett." The desk sergeant swallowed hard, glanced once at Monroe, then nodded and unlocked a battered gray filing cabinet. Thick folders were pulled out, thudding onto the desk. Leonard crossed the room with slow, deliberate steps and picked up the first folder. Monroe's. He flipped it open, and for a moment a rare flicker of genuine anger crossed his face. Excessive force complaints, civilian harassment reports, suspensions quietly buried. It was all there, page after damning page. Leonard closed the file and handed it to one of the agents without a word. His message was clear. The rot ran deep, and it was going to be ripped out root and stem. Meanwhile, outside, the crowd had grown. News vans parked haphazardly along the curb. Protesters waved hastily made signs. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashing whenever the station doors so much as cracked open. Savannah wasn't sleeping tonight, and this time the story wasn't being buried. It was breaking loose, too big to contain. Back inside, Leonard turned toward the assembled officers. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but carried the undeniable weight of authority. If any evidence disappears, if any records are altered, if anyone obstructs this investigation, federal charges will be filed immediately. And I guarantee you, he said, sweeping his gaze across them all, there will be convictions. No one moved. No one spoke. Even Monroe stayed silent now, his chest heaving with angry breaths, but his mouth tightly shut. The federal agents continued moving like a disciplined swarm, gathering evidence, pulling data, taking statements. It was a takeover. Not with violence, but with precision. Every hard drive cloned, every file photographed, every officer's login credentials locked down. Eleanor watched all of it with a strange calm blooming inside her. This wasn't vengeance. This wasn't revenge. This was truth, pulling itself out from under the wreckage they had tried to bury it beneath. And for once, the system was actually working in the favor of the wronged instead of the powerful. Leonard stepped back to Elena's side. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. Together they stood as the precinct crumbled from within. Elena shifted her gaze to Monroe one last time. Their eyes met across the crowded, tense lobby. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. Monroe looked away first. Outside, the chanting grew louder. "Justice for Elena! No more corruption! We see you!" The words rolled through the humid night like thunder, shaking the windows. Elena took a slow breath and let it fill her lungs fully for the first time that evening. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was bigger, deeper. It was about a wound Savannah had tried to pretend didn't exist, and about a reckoning that could no longer be delayed. Leonard touched her elbow gently. "It's time," he said. Elena nodded. Together they turned toward the front doors. The agents moved to escort them, but Leonard waved them off. This moment, he seemed to understand, belonged to Elena. She walked forward on her own, the heavy doors creaking open under her hand. As she stepped outside, a wall of cameras, phones, and lights met her. For a moment, she stood framed by it all. The nurse who had been wrongfully accused, wrongfully arrested, and who had refused to disappear quietly. The crowd erupted into cheers. Someone near the front yelled her name. Elena lifted her chin slightly, steady, strong. She didn't raise her arms. She didn't shout. She just stood there, letting the world see her exactly as she was, unbroken. And for the first time in a long time, she truly believed this was only the beginning. The scene outside the precinct had transformed into something bigger than Elena could have ever imagined. What had started as a small group of concerned citizens had swelled into a full-blown rally. The crowd surged against the metal barricades hastily erected by the city's overwhelmed police department. News anchors from every major network were setting up live shots. Microphones were thrust forward. Flashbulbs exploded in rapid succession. Elena stood in the middle of it all, Leonard at her side, the federal agents close but allowing her the space to be seen. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't shrinking. She faced the crowd, the reporters, the glaring lights with a steady calm that made her seem larger than life. And the people responded. Cheers broke out. Applause thundered across the parking lot. Signs waved high. Justice for Elena. No more silence. Accountability now. Reporters shouted questions one after another, overlapping, desperate to capture the moment. Elena, how do you feel right now? Do you think justice will truly be served? Will you press charges? Elena didn't rush to answer. She let the moment breathe. She let them see that she was not broken, not beaten, and not here to be a footnote in their news cycle. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, firm, and clear enough that it cut through the noise like a blade. I'm standing here because I refuse to disappear, Elena said. I'm standing here because every person who has been silenced, humiliated, or cast aside deserves to be seen, deserves to be heard. The crowd erupted again, louder this time. Even some of the reporters paused, caught by the raw force of her conviction. Leonard gave her a small nod from the corner of her eye. No words needed. She was doing exactly what she was meant to do. Elena continued, her voice gaining strength. Tonight is not the end of anything. Tonight is just the beginning. We are not powerless. We are not invisible. And we will not be silenced. The cheering grew into a roar, echoing into the sticky Georgia night. Cameras captured every second, broadcasting it live across the country. People at home, flipping through channels, paused as they saw her. A tired, strong woman standing against a system that had tried and failed to erase her. Behind the crowd, more officials arrived. Representatives from the mayor's office, lawyers from the Department of Justice, civil rights advocates who had been waiting for a case like this to ignite real change. Leonard moved among them, quiet but commanding, speaking low and firm, making it clear. This wasn't a story to be managed, it was a reckoning to be answered. Meanwhile, inside the precinct, chaos reigned. Officers who had once ruled the building with lazy arrogance now found themselves trapped. Phones rang off the hook with reporters asking for statements. Internal affairs officers began quietly assembling files. Supervisors barked conflicting orders. The foundation was crumbling, and they knew it. Officer Monroe sat slumped behind the front desk, his earlier defiance gone, replaced by a cold, dawning understanding. There would be no quick fix this time. There would be no quiet backroom deal, no gentle slap on the wrist. His career, his reputation, everything he had built by intimidation and abuse was collapsing in real time, and there wasn't a thing he could do to stop it. Outside, Elena turned slightly toward Leonard. "What happens now?" she asked under her breath, her voice still carrying the weight of the night. Leonard didn't hesitate. "Now," he said quietly, "they realize this isn't just about you. It's about all the people who came before you, and all the people who were supposed to come after you but never got the chance." Elena nodded slowly. She understood. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It never had been. She glanced back at the crowd. at the signs waving in the humid breeze, at the faces shouting her name and demanding justice. She didn't know every one of their stories, but she knew they were all connected by a common thread, a system that had failed them over and over again. One of the federal agents approached Leonard with a firm expression. "Sir, DOJ headquarters is requesting a formal statement within the next hour. They want to begin immediate federal oversight procedures." Leonard nodded once. "We'll handle it," he said. Then he turned to Elena. "If you're ready, there's more work to do." Elena smiled faintly, the kind of smile that wasn't about joy but about determination. "I'm ready," she said simply. Around them, the cameras kept flashing, the chants kept rising, and the world, for the first time in a long time, seemed willing to listen. And this time, they weren't going to stop until the whole truth was finally out in the light. As Elena stood among the crowd, a quiet but powerful shift was already happening behind the scenes. Inside the precinct, the Department of Justice agents were deep into the files. One after another, reports were pulled, scanned, cross-checked. Patterns began emerging almost immediately, disturbing patterns that no one could deny anymore. Officer Monroe wasn't just an overzealous cop. His file revealed years of documented abuse, excessive force complaints, racial profiling allegations, falsified reports. Every time, the incidents had been quietly swept under the rug by internal supervisors. The records weren't just ugly, they were damning. Elena hadn't just been a random target, she had been caught in a system that had long abandoned any pretense of fairness. Officer Bennett's file wasn't as thick, but it wasn't clean either. While Monroe acted, Bennett enabled. Witness statements described him standing by during abusive arrests, turning a blind eye when Monroe escalated situations unnecessarily. He wasn't a monster, but he had become complicit. A silent witness who chose his own comfort over doing the right thing. And now that silence was coming back to haunt him. The federal agents moved fast. They didn't just look at the two officers. They widened the net. They pulled disciplinary files on the pharmacy manager Brenda Lawson, who had initiated the call. Turns out, Brenda had a history too, several customer complaints about discriminatory behavior, none of which had ever been seriously investigated by the corporate office. The rot wasn't isolated, it had tentacles, and now every tentacle was being exposed to the light. Leonard Brooks watched it all unfold with grim satisfaction. He had seen it too many times before. The casual corruption, the lazy cruelty, the systems designed not to correct injustice but to protect it. But this time was different. This time, they weren't working in the shadows. Everything was being documented, exposed, prepared for court. Outside, the mood was electric. Protesters began organizing into small groups, exchanging phone numbers, setting up speakers to amplify their voices. Leaders emerged organically. Young activists, veteran civil rights advocates, even a few clergy members, each taking a turn on portable microphones to call for change. Elena watched them from a distance for a moment, letting the energy sink into her bones. She could feel it now, the difference between anger and momentum. This wasn't just rage, it was resolve. It was organized, focused, ready to last longer than one night. Leonard approached quietly, a thin file tucked under his arm. "We have enough," he said, voice low but certain. "Enough to bring criminal charges. Enough to force a full audit of the precinct. Enough to drag every hidden truth into the daylight." Elena nodded slowly. "Good," she said, but even as she said it, a heavy weariness pulled at her bones. Fighting wasn't easy, and even victories carried scars. One of the DOJ agents handed Leonard a printout. He scanned it quickly, then handed it to Elena. It was a list, names of other civilians who had filed complaints over the past decade, names that had been buried, silenced, erased. Elena ran her finger down the page slowly. So many names, so many lives disrupted, derailed, destroyed. "This isn't just about you," Leonard said gently. "You were the match. But the fire, this fire, has been waiting for years. Elena folded the paper and tucked it into her jacket pocket, close to her heart. "Then let's make sure it burns down everything that needs to be burned," she said. A sharp cheer went up from the front of the crowd. Another speaker was taking the microphone, calling for citywide reform, demanding a review of every police interaction, demanding public access to body cam footage, demanding real, enforceable change, not just promises when the cameras were rolling. This time it wasn't just noise. Elena could feel it, humming in the air, crackling like a coming storm. The city officials inside the station realized it too. Panic rippled through the command structure. Supervisors scrambled to issue statements. The mayor's office issued a hurried press release promising full cooperation with the DOJ's investigation. It was too little, too late. The story had grown beyond their control. By midnight, national media had picked up the narrative. CNN, MSNBC, even international outlets. Headlines blared across social media. Savannah under federal investigation after wrongful arrest. Local nurse sparks national movement for police reform. Justice for Elena. A city at a crossroad. Leonard looked at Elena, a rare warmth flickering across his otherwise steely features. "You did this," he said simply. Not accusing, not blaming, just stating the truth. Eleanor thought about it for a moment. About the humiliation she had endured, about the quiet dignity she had fought to maintain even in handcuffs, about the long line of people who had suffered in silence before her. "I didn't want to," she said, her voice soft but unshakable. "But maybe I was supposed to." Leonard smiled slightly. "Sometimes," he said, "history doesn't ask politely." They stood there a moment longer, shoulder to shoulder, watching the city they loved waking up from its long, willful sleep. The road ahead would be brutal, they both knew it. There would be resistance, backlash, attempts to minimize and bury the truth again. But none of that mattered right now. Right now, for the first time in a long time, justice wasn't just a word. It was a living thing, breathing in the streets of Savannah, refusing to be silenced ever again. By the following morning, the city of Savannah felt completely different. The energy that had sparked the night before had not faded, it had intensified. News outlets camped outside City Hall. Protesters, no longer just angry but now highly organized, set up information booths and legal aid stations along the streets. Social media buzzed with calls for action, petitions, and rallying cries. Inside City Hall, a crisis meeting was underway. The mayor, pale and exhausted, sat at the head of a long table flanked by his advisors, police chiefs, and legal counsel. The night had brought a flood of bad headlines, each more damning than the last. Their carefully managed public image had collapsed overnight, and now every eye in the country was watching. There was no more hiding. There was no more pretending. The mayor tapped his fingers against the table, the silence unbearable. Finally, he spoke. "We have to move fast," he said, voice hoarse. "If we delay, we lose everything." His advisors nodded grimly. Their solution was simple, desperate, and obvious: a public apology, a pledge for reform, a chance to stop the bleeding before the city bled out entirely under the heat of national scrutiny. By noon, a press conference was hastily arranged on the steps of City Hall. Elena was invited to attend, but not as a guest of honor. The city wanted to parade her in front of cameras, hoping her presence would soften the public's fury. Leonard warned her, "This is not for your benefit, it's for theirs. Go, but stay sharp." Elena agreed, but on her own terms. She would not be a prop in their performance. If they wanted her there, they would hear her voice, not just her presence. When she arrived, the scene was surreal. Cameras lined the streets. Reporters swarmed every sidewalk. Protesters filled the square, their signs high, their chants steady. "Justice for Elena, no more cover-ups, change now." The mayor stepped up to the podium, his hands visibly shaking as he adjusted the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "we are here today to acknowledge the grave mistakes that have been made in our city." He glanced nervously toward Elena, standing tall among the crowd. "We recognize that Miss Elena Hayes was wrongfully detained, mistreated, and humiliated by officers sworn to serve and protect. A murmur swept through the crowd. Some clapped, some booed. No one looked satisfied. Words alone, Elena knew, wouldn't be enough. Not anymore. The mayor continued, stumbling through promises of reform, independent reviews, mandatory bias training, community oversight boards. Promises Elena had heard before in other cities, other scandals. Words spoken to quiet anger, not to build real change. When he finished, he turned slightly, inviting Elena forward with a small, tentative gesture. Elena didn't rush. She walked steadily to the microphone, every step deliberate. She could feel the weight of thousands of eyes on her, the crowd, the cameras, the entire country waiting to hear what she would say. She took a breath, then another, and then she spoke. "I did not survive what happened to me just so I could stand here and accept pretty words," Elena said, her voice ringing clear across the plaza. "Acknowledgement is not justice. Apology is not accountability. Promises are not change." The crowd erupted in cheers. Even some of the reporters looked stunned, their pens pausing mid-scratch. Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger with every word. "Real justice means consequences for those who abuse their power. Real change means tearing down the systems that allowed it to happen in the first place. Real healing only begins when truth is faced fully, not when it's papered over with empty speeches." She turned slightly, her eyes sweeping the officials lined up behind her, the mayor, the police chief, the city attorneys. She didn't flinch. "I will not accept words. I will accept action. I will accept accountability. I will accept a city that proves through its deeds, not its promises, that it values every life equally." Thunderous applause shook the square. Chants rose again, louder than before, fueled by new energy, new hope. Elena stepped back from the microphone but remained standing, unyielding, a visible reminder that the days of quiet suffering were over. Leonard watched from the side, pride flickering across his normally stern face. She had taken everything they tried to use against her, humiliation, fear, silence, and turned it into a weapon sharper than anything they had. The mayor tried to respond, but the noise drowned him out. It didn't matter. The city had already made its decision. They would either change or be changed. As Elena turned to leave, a reporter shouted after her, "Elena, what's next for you?" She paused, smiled faintly, and answered without hesitation, "Building something better." And with that, she disappeared into the crowd, not as a victim, not even just as a survivor, but as a catalyst for a revolution that had only just begun. In the weeks that followed, Elena's life shifted into something she barely recognized. The protests outside City Hall continued day and night, gaining numbers and intensity. What began as anger over one wrongful arrest had become something much bigger, a demand for systemic reform that echoed through every street of Savannah. Elena didn't seek the spotlight, but it found her anyway. Invitations poured in, interviews, rallies, panel discussions. Civil rights organizations reached out, offering support, asking her to speak, to lead, to represent something larger than herself. At first, she hesitated. She wasn't an activist. She wasn't a politician. She was a nurse, a woman who had simply wanted to live her life quietly. But deep down, Elena knew she couldn't walk away now. Too many people were watching. Too many people had been silenced before her. If she didn't stand up, who would? Leonard Brooks remained by her side, his presence steady, grounding. He helped organize meetings with lawyers, civil rights leaders, and Department of Justice officials. Together, they built a plan, not just to punish those responsible for Elena's humiliation, but to demand sweeping changes in the city's policing policies. The lawsuit came first. Elena filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against the Savannah Police Department, Officer Monroe, Officer Bennett, and the city of Savannah itself. The charges were clear: unlawful arrest, violation of constitutional rights, violational discrimination, abuse of authority. The case hit the media like a thunderclap, reigniting the national spotlight. News anchors debated it, Editorials praised Elena's courage, politicians scrambled to respond. And yet, Elena stayed grounded. She didn't give fiery speeches, she didn't seek revenge, she spoke calmly, firmly, always bringing the focus back to the bigger issue, not just her story, but the hundreds, maybe thousands of others like her, whose names the world would never know. The lawsuit forced the city into action. Discovery requests began pulling internal emails, exposing a culture of cover-ups, favoritism, and suppressed complaints. Officers who once felt untouchable now found themselves under scrutiny. Body cam footage, once casually edited or lost, was now front and center, revealing patterns of abuse that could no longer be denied. Elena sat through endless meetings with lawyers, strategy sessions with organizers, and quiet debriefings with Leonard late into the night. It was exhausting. It was overwhelming. But every time she thought about stepping back, she remembered the boy she had seen once, handcuffed face down on the sidewalk, the woman she had heard about, who had disappeared into the system without a word. This wasn't just about her anymore. It never had been. By the end of the month, Savannah's leadership cracked under the pressure. The police chief resigned, citing health reasons. Several senior officers either retired early or were placed on administrative leave pending federal investigations. The mayor, once defensive, now begged for meetings with community leaders, promising full cooperation. A citizens' oversight board was formally established, with the power to investigate misconduct independently. Reforms began to take shape, not just promises but tangible changes written into law. Mandatory de-escalation training, body cam footage released within 72 hours of any incident, anonymous reporting systems for civilian complaints. Elena watched all of it unfold with a strange mix of hope and skepticism. She knew change didn't happen in one sweep. It was slow, it was painful, it came in pieces, often fought for every inch of the way. But it was happening. At one point, a reporter asked her during an interview, "Do you feel like you've won?" Elena paused, thoughtful. "No," she said softly. "Winning would mean nobody else ever goes through what I did. Winning would mean justice isn't the exception, it's the norm. We're not there yet, but maybe." She smiled faintly. "Maybe we've started something that will outlast all of us." Behind her, Leonard nodded, silent but proud. And across the country, other cities were beginning to take notice. Activists cited Savannah as proof that pressure worked, that standing up mattered, that even the smallest crack in the wall of injustice could grow if enough people pushed together. Savannah was changing, slowly, imperfectly, but undeniably. And at the center of it all stood Elena Hayes, not a politician, not a celebrity, but a woman who had refused to be erased, a woman who had turned her pain into a battle cry for something better. And she was just getting started. As Savannah slowly shifted under the weight of real reform, Elena realized her journey wasn't ending. It was expanding. The victory at home had lit a spark across the nation. Civil rights organizations in other cities began reaching out, asking for advice, seeking guidance. Communities that had been too afraid to speak now found courage in Elena's story. It started with a few speaking engagements, small gatherings at community centers, universities, churches. Elena would stand before crowds of 100, then 1,000, telling her story not with bitterness, but with clarity. She spoke about resilience, about refusing to accept injustice as normal, about ordinary people finding extraordinary strength when it mattered most. Everywhere she went, people lined up afterward to thank her, to share their own stories of wrongful stops, of discrimination at school, at work, on the streets. Many of them had never told anyone before, but something about Elena, the way she carried herself, the quiet power in her voice, made them believe they weren't alone anymore. Leonard watched it unfold with quiet pride. He continued to handle logistics, setting up meetings with advocacy groups, coordinating with civil rights attorneys, ensuring Elena could focus on the movement without being overwhelmed. He didn't push her onto bigger stages. He simply cleared the path for her to walk if she chose to. And walk she did. Within months, Elena became one of the most recognizable voices in the new wave of grassroots civil rights activism. She refused offers from political parties to run for office. She wasn't interested in titles or power. What she wanted was simple and profound: real change, real justice, and real accountability. Major media outlets began covering her journey not as a passing story, but as part of a broader national reckoning. Documentaries were pitched, podcasts clamored for interviews. Young organizers began quoting her speeches at rallies. Her message was simple, but it resonated. Dignity is not something granted by the powerful. It is something inherent in every human being, and it demands to be respected. Savannah, too, kept changing. With every policy reform implemented, every corrupt officer held accountable, Elena's hometown became a living example that transformation was possible. It wasn't perfect, change never was, but it was real. At a major rally in Atlanta, standing in front of nearly 10,000 people, Elena said something that would later be quoted across the country. "We don't rise by being silent, we rise by standing together, not just when it's easy, but especially when it's hard. Especially when the world wants us to sit down, shut up, and disappear." The crowd erupted. People wept openly. Parents lifted their children onto their shoulders so they could see her. And in that moment, Elena understood something even deeper. This was no longer just about righting the wrongs of her own arrest. It was about reclaiming dignity for countless lives pushed into the margins. The Department of Justice invited Elena to participate in advisory panels helping shape national police reform guidelines. Law schools asked her to speak about civil rights. Nonprofits sought her advice on building more sustainable movements. Still, Elena stayed true to herself. She returned often to Savannah, walking the familiar streets, checking in on the young activists who had risen from the protests, listening more than she spoke. She made sure the spotlight didn't blind the cause. One evening, as she sat with Leonard on the back porch of her modest house, watching the Georgia stars blink awake, he turned to her and asked quietly, "Did you ever think it would become this big?" Elena smiled softly, the kind of smile that held both pride and sorrow. "No," she said, "I never wanted any of this. But now that it's here," she looked up at the night sky, "I'm not letting it go to waste." Leonard nodded. "Good," he said simply. In the distance, sirens wailed, a reminder that the work was far from finished. But Elena Hayes had already proven something to the world, and more importantly, to herself. No matter how small you start, no matter how brutal the system seems, one voice refusing to be silenced can start an earthquake. And the ground was still shaking. Success, Elena quickly learned, came with a price. As her influence grew, so did the resistance. It started subtly. Angry emails, anonymous threats, carefully crafted smear pieces in the media, painting her as a radical or opportunist. People who had once ignored her suffering now accused her of stirring division, of going too far. Elena refused to engage publicly with the hate. Leonard advised her early on, "Don't waste your energy fighting shadows. Focus on the real battles." She took his advice to heart. Every insult hurled at her only sharpened her determination. If anything, the backlash confirmed what she had always known. True change would never come without a fight. But it wasn't just online trolls or right-wing pundits that worried Elena. Some of the greatest threats came from within the system she was trying to reform. In private meetings, some city officials grumbled about the oversight board's power, about the new transparency policies. Whispers floated through political circles, suggesting that if Elena could be discredited, even quietly, momentum for reform might stall. Leonard caught wind of it first. Through old contacts still loyal to him, he learned there were plans to dig into Elena's background, searching for anything that could be twisted into a scandal, a late payment, a mistake from her past, any. When he told her, Elena sat still for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then she simply said, "Let them look, I have nothing to hide." And it was true. Her life wasn't perfect, No one's was, but there were no skeletons, no dark secrets to weaponize against her. She had lived simply, worked hard, loved fiercely, and when injustice came for her, she had stood up. That was her record. Still, the attacks came. One evening, a sensationalized news report falsely claimed Elena had incited violence during a protest she hadn't even attended. The next morning, death threats poured into the inboxes of the civil rights organizations that supported her. Some donors pulled back. Some local politicians who had once smiled for photo ops at rallies began to distance themselves. It would have been easy, almost understandable, for Elena to step back, to say, "I've done enough," and retreat to a quieter life. But Elena wasn't built that way. Instead, she called a press conference. Standing on the courthouse steps, in front of dozens of cameras and reporters, she addressed the nation not with anger but with unwavering clarity. "I am not your scapegoat," Elena said. "I am not your villain. I am a woman who stood up because I refused to be erased. I knew this path would be hard. I knew it would cost me things I love, but I chose it anyway because injustice is worse than fear." Her voice rose, steady and clear. "You cannot intimidate a movement built on truth. You cannot erase a community that has found its voice. You cannot silence the millions who now believe that change is not only possible, it is necessary." Across the country, her words spread like wildfire. Hashtags trended, editorials shifted tone. Allies who had stayed silent during the attack stepped forward again, emboldened. New faces joined the movement. Young people, teachers, nurses, veterans, parents who saw their own struggles reflected in Elena's fight. The smear campaign failed spectacularly. And the Department of Justice, noticing the escalation of threats, moved to offer federal protection for Elena during public events. She accepted it reluctantly, not because she feared for herself, but because she knew she had a responsibility now to the people who believed in her. Savannah, meanwhile, continued to evolve. Under pressure from activists, new legislation was introduced to hold officers accountable for misconduct. Civilian oversight expanded. City leaders learned the hard way that performative promises weren't enough. Real action was demanded, monitored, and expected. And in the heart of it all, Elena Hayes remained. Steady, unbroken, unafraid. Late one night, sitting alone at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, Elena reflected on everything that had happened. The girl she had been, the one humiliated under the flickering fluorescent lights of a pharmacy, felt like someone else now. But she hadn't changed because she wanted to. She had changed because she had to. And she understood something profound. True leadership wasn't about being the loudest voice or the most polished speaker. It was about standing your ground when the world tried to push you down. About carrying others when their strength faltered. About knowing that even if you didn't live to see the final victory, the fight itself was still worth everything. Outside her window, the streets of Savannah were quieter now, but not asleep. The city was awake, aware, forever changed by a woman who refused to let it go back to sleep. And somewhere deep in the night, with a storm of resistance still swirling around her, Elena Hayes smiled. Because she knew this was only the beginning. With the worst of the attacks behind her, Elena found herself stepping into a new and unexpected role: mentor. Across the country, a new generation of activists was rising. Young, fierce, and unafraid, they looked to Elena not just for inspiration, but for guidance. They flooded her inbox with messages. High school students starting civic clubs, college organizers planning protests, young professionals launching advocacy campaigns in their cities. They didn't just want to be heard, they wanted to be trained. They wanted to know how to stand their ground when the cameras left, when the pressure mounted, when the backlash came. Elena didn't see herself as a teacher, but she understood the responsibility resting on her shoulders. She knew that courage alone wasn't enough. Movements survived because they were built carefully, thoughtfully, with strategy, resilience, and an unshakable moral compass. So she began organizing workshops, quietly at first, in borrowed community centers and church basements, then more publicly as the demand exploded. Building the movement seminars, they called them. Sessions on legal rights during protests, on de-escalation strategies, on sustaining momentum after the headlines faded. Elena wasn't trying to create an army. She was building architects, people who could design better futures in their own communities. One evening, after a particularly powerful workshop in Birmingham, a teenager approached her, clutching a battered notebook. His voice shook slightly as he asked, "Miss Hayes, how do you keep going when it feels like nobody's listening?" Elena smiled, warm but serious. She knelt so she was eye level with him. "You remember why you started," she said simply. "You remember that change isn't measured by how loud the world cheers for you. It's measured by whether you keep going when it doesn't." The boy blinked rapidly, nodding, and tucked her words away like armor. Moments like that became common. Quiet conversations in hallways after meetings. Long emails from young women in rural towns facing harassment for speaking out. Messages from young men who had lost friends to police violence and were trying to channel their grief into action. Elena answered every message she could. She didn't offer platitudes. She offered honesty. The road was hard. The system was bigger than any one person. Victories would sometimes be small, sometimes invisible, but the fight was still worth it. Her movement, if it could even be called that, grew organically. Messy, vibrant, alive. No single leader, no rigid hierarchy, just thousands of ordinary people carrying the flame Elena had rekindled, lighting up corners of the country that had long been left in darkness. And the impact was undeniable. In city after city, policies began to shift, community review boards formed, body cam footage laws strengthened. Police departments that had once resisted oversight now scrambled to implement reforms before being forced to. Young politicians, many of them inspired by Elena's story, began winning local elections on platforms of justice and transparency. The country wasn't fixed. It was far from perfect. But the ground was shifting in ways that even the most cynical observers couldn't ignore. At a rally marking the anniversary of her own arrest, Elena stood before a sea of faces, old and young, black and white, from every background imaginable. She took a deep breath and said, "You are the proof that they were wrong about us, that we are not powerless, that we are not invisible, that when we stand together, no force on earth can silence us." The roar that rose from the crowd was almost physical. A wave of sound and spirit that lifted Elena off her feet in a way no applause ever had. Later that night, sitting quietly with Leonard and a few close friends, she allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. "Do you ever wonder," she asked softly, "what would have happened if I had just walked away that night? If I hadn't stood my ground?" Leonard looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of pride and gratitude. "No," he said simply, "because you didn't, and that made all the difference." And in her heart, Ayla knew he was right. It wasn't fate that had changed the world around her. It wasn't luck. It was the simple, stubborn choice to stand firm when everything around her tried to make her kneel. And because she had made that choice, thousands of others now stood too. Not perfectly, not without fear, but proudly, together. Years later, long after the marches quieted and the headlines shifted to other battles, Elena Hayes remained a name spoken with quiet reverence. Not because she sought fame, she never did, but because of what she had sparked and what she refused to let die. Savannah, the city that had once humiliated her, now bore the signs of her fight everywhere. The Community Justice Center stood in the heart of downtown, a place where citizens could report abuses without fear, staffed by people trained in fairness and transparency. The Elena Hayes Civic Leadership Scholarship helped dozens of young people from marginalized communities pursue dreams that once felt impossible. Her impact wasn't just in laws or buildings, it lived in people. The young woman who had once clutched Elena's hand in a church basement was now an attorney fighting wrongful convictions. The teenager who had asked how to stay strong was now a city councilman leading reform. Across the country, countless others, some of whom had never even met Elena, carried forward the work she had inspired. Elena herself never craved recognition. She preferred to slip quietly into meetings, to sit at the back of rallies, to listen more than she spoke. She understood that true leadership wasn't about the spotlight. It was about making sure the flame outlived the spark. One spring morning, many years after the night that changed everything, Elena stood alone outside the old pharmacy. The building was different now. Bright, welcoming, painted with a mural of unity and justice. But the ghosts of the past still whispered from the bricks. She ran her fingers along the rough wall, remembering, not with anger but with a deep, almost bittersweet gratitude, because it had started here, because pain had become purpose. Leonard joined her quietly, older now, his stride slower but his spirit just as fierce. He said nothing at first, only standing beside her, letting the moment breathe. Finally he spoke, his voice low. "You did more than survive, Elena. You changed the air we all breathe." She smiled, blinking back the sting in her eyes. "I just refused to let them write the ending for me." Leonard chuckled. "You didn't just change the ending, you tore up the whole script." They stood there for a while, two warriors who had seen too much, fought too long, loved too fiercely to ever turn away. As the sun climbed higher, casting warm light over the mural, Elena took a deep breath, feeling the weight of it all. The battles won, the ones still left to fight. The countless hands now lifting the work higher than she could ever have done alone. "I was never alone," she said quietly, more to herself than to Leonard. And she wasn't. The movement had grown beyond her, had taken root deep in the soil of communities she would never see, flowering into 1,000 small, stubborn acts of justice every single day. That was the real legacy. Not the speeches, not the headlines, but the simple, breathtaking truth that when one person stands up, others find the courage to stand too. And once they rise, there's no going back. Elena turned from the old pharmacy, her heart full, her spirit steady. She wasn't finished. Not yet. There were always more battles to fight, more stories to change, more fires to light, and she would keep lighting them, as long as she breathed. Elena's story reminds us that real change doesn't come easy. It demands courage, persistence, and the willingness to stand even when your legs are shaking. Her journey proves that one voice, one choice, one act of defiance can ripple out and move mountains. If this story inspired you, if it sparked even a small flame inside you, don't let it end here. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Leave us a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your story too. And most importantly, if you believe in the power of standing up for what's right, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story that matters. Because together, one step at a time, we can make a difference. And remember, your voice is stronger than you think. Use it.